Hello and welcome to Religion in America. Today we will be looking at the birth of the Republic and also the Republic and the churches. Um, so we're going to pull up the PowerPoint, and the first thing I want to point out is that this is starting with the idea of Christianity and the war for independence. Notice that there had been a long history of discussion about when war is justified within Christianity. At times, Christians have embraced pacifism. Arguably, much of the early church embraced pacifism. At times, it embraced just war theory. At times, it had embraced um, crusades and holy wars. But notice that drawing upon the Apostle Paul's statement in Romans that Christians should be subject to the powers that be, many Christian just war advocates argued that revolution was never just cause. You had to have a legitimate authority, and that it had a very traditional understanding from the divine right of kings to the idea that God worked through the various leaders. So in some ways, this was a challenge for people to justify the war in terms that could be reconciled with Christianity. Part of that was inspired by the history of conflicts, the burnings in England under Mary Tudor, persecution in Scotland under Mary Stuart. Looking at the various wars of religion, many Reformed leaders began to suggest that resistance and rebellion could also be justified in terms of Christian ethics. Of course, the Church of England did not think that the Revolutionary War was justified. Um, the Church of England had only been established in Virginia, and as we said earlier, they represented a minority among the colonists. But after a revolution in 1688, the Anglicans decided, the Church of England decided it would be helpful to try to increase the Anglican establishments in the various colonies. They thought that if they could convert people to the Church of England, they would be less likely to resist England. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel was specifically designed not so much just to promote the gospel and Christianity in general, but specifically to try to convert people from other denominations back to the Anglican tradition. And notice that many people thought that the um, Church of England and the government of England were very difficult to distinguish. So, how did the various churches respond to the Revolutionary War? Obviously, the Church of England opposed it. Historically, pacifist churches may have been sympathetic to the claims of the revolutionaries for rights and for justice, but the Quakers, Mennonites, Moravians, and others argued that war was not the answer. That's not how we bring about the kingdom of God on earth. That's not how we resolve our conflicts. Still, other communities, the Dutch, German Reformed, Lutheran, Roman Catholic, Jewish communities, many of them were minorities, and they didn't necessarily expect to be treated better by um, the revolutionaries than they did by the British. But the communities that provided the strongest support for the Revolutionary War, at least in terms of religious justification and legitimation, were the Congregational, Presbyterian, and Baptist churches. As a result, you can tell after the Revolutionary War, the Anglican Church lost a lot of members. The historic peace churches also lost members. Um, the Congregational, Presbyterian, and Baptist churches actually increased after the Revolutionary War. So when we think about the United States and we think about religion, one of the questions that we think of is the US Constitution. How much of it has been shaped by religion? How much of it is a secular document? Notice the First Amendment to the US Constitution provides the religious liberty and establishment clauses. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. How do we explain this practice taking place in the United States in the late 18th century? Some of it can be explained by looking at the European Enlightenment, which led to a certain amount of secularization, appealing to the world in terms of science and reason instead of religion. Thomas Jefferson famously wrote his own Jefferson Bible, and he did so largely with a pair of scissors by removing the miracles and magic and identifying Christianity as a religion that taught about how human beings should relate to one another. Another reason that the United States would support this separation of church and state was because every denomination was a religious minority. I suppose if the Quakers had been the majority, they might have tried to impose their will. If the Baptists or the Methodists or the Anglicans, if anyone had been a majority, they may well have tried to impose their will. But there was a certain sense in which, okay, if I'm going to be a minority, I don't want those other people to be in charge and tell me what to do. So, in a sense, it's not that everyone was tolerant and loved and respected everyone else. Part of it was a matter of self interest. On the opposite end of the Enlightenment and the concerns of Thomas Jefferson and others who feared that religion makes politics irrational, you had church leaders like Roger Williams, one of the co-founders of the Baptist tradition in the United States, who argued that when you mix religion and politics, you corrupt the church. So if Jefferson was concerned to protect politics from religion, you could argue Williams was concerned to protect religion from politics. So there was quite a broad range of people who ended up supporting this idea of a separation of church and state. Elaborating a little bit more on the concept of deism, notice that many of the uh, founders, fathers of American democracy rejected the idea that all knowledge should come from the Bible. Instead, they argued that in a modernist society, we should be able to appeal to reason more broadly. So they talked more in terms of human rights. They often made no direct attack on revealed religion. Even people like Thomas Jefferson, who had written his own version of the Bible, didn't have difficulty combining with Christians, some of whom came out of the Great Awakening traditions, to work on their common goals. Um, there were some people who served as bridges. William Penn, Algernon Sidney, and John Locke were able to speak both the language of Puritan political ideas and the language of human rights, the language of the European Enlightenment. And so all of these figures, and I would say particularly John Locke, was influential in helping to bridge those two different communities. Notice that unlike today's culture wars, where you often see secular and traditional religious people more in conflict, people like Jefferson and Washington and Franklin really didn't have much desire to fight with the people at large. They often thought that common people could benefit from traditional religion. There is a little bit of a class difference here. Many of the more well-educated and sometimes wealthier Americans were more likely to lean towards deism, whereas many who were less well-educated were more likely to embrace more traditional Christianity. However, even the figures influenced by the European Enlightenment, Jefferson, Franklin, Adams, and others, insisted that the United States was somehow a part of God's plan and saw God's hand in the creation of this nation. Now, how is it that traditional Christians could also come together and find common cause with Enlightenment figures? Notice that English Puritans had already distinguished between what we might call revealed religion and natural religion. Revealed religion is the particular tenets that can be found in the Bible. Natural religion is, they argued, something that can be found in all of God's children, regardless of where and when they were born. There are certain things that are just obvious, how we should treat one another, for example. As a result, evangelicals could work with deists, Jews, and others who didn't emphasize Christian revelation if they could come to similar conclusions about liberty and justice and property and things like that. I mentioned John Locke earlier, but his letter concerning toleration um, argued that both human rights and traditional religion encouraged us to be forgiving, graceful, and tolerant with people who are different from ourselves. So, how religious is the US Constitution? Notice that the US Constitution only has two references to religion. One of them is the First Amendment that we've already discussed. The other is Article 6, no religious test shall be required as a qualification to any office or public trust. If you look at these, you can sense that there really is not a lot of explicit religious references in the Constitution. In fact, the framers of the Constitution seem to try to move away from, quote, revealed religion. Um, on the other hand, I want to point out that the First Amendment, talking about the separation of church and state, really only applied to the federal government until the 14th Amendment in 1866 with the Equal Protection Clause after the Civil War, saying that we are citizens of the United States first and citizens of any state second. After that, the Constitution separation of church and state was increasingly applied to states and also to local jurisdictions, including beginning in the 1960s, schools, which had largely been forces for mainline Protestant socialization, and a lot of conflict occurred between different religious communities um, as traditional religion, or I should say, particularly more mainline Protestant Christianity, was removed from the public schools. But even if the religious elements are not explicit in the creation of the Constitution, there are some things that do seem to reflect Christian influence. Um, the notion of a constitution, not surprisingly, echoes the notion of a covenant between God and Israel. If God promises this, uh, the land of Israel, then the people promise to follow Mosaic law, for example. This notion of a constitution as a contract, an agreement between people and the state, it does have some echoes with the Abrahamic religions. One could argue that there are certain values that are consistent with Christianity, um, respect for human beings' lives, although you can argue that that was not fully realized at the time the Constitution was created, respect for liberty. Um, but at a more specific level, if the European Enlightenment emphasized a very optimistic view of human nature and human potential, the Puritans emphasized a very pessimistic view of human nature. And you can see this pessimistic view of human nature throughout the Constitution. Calvin talked about original sin and the inevitability of self interest. The Constitution supports term limits so that people are not like kings keeping their positions of power, certainly not handing it down from generation to generation. The idea that people can be voted out of office, the idea that we have two legislatures, the House and the Senate. This bicameral arrangement provides a certain set of checks and balances so that neither branch can become too powerful. And you have three branches of government, so that the president cannot be like a king. He's checked by the power of the legislative and the judicial branches. So each of these different forms of checks and balances were designed to prevent power from being um, gathered too strongly in any one place, because of the idea of the sinfulness of human beings and the self-interest that we tend to follow. So, what happens to religious freedom after the Revolutionary War? Notice that even before the Revolutionary War, four of the colonies had been dedicated to religious liberty. The Anglican establishments in five of the remaining colonies quickly toppled. There were debates about how to do the separation of church and state. One argument was multiple establishment. What if there were taxpayer money being used to support all religions equally, or as a percentage of the population or something like this? Ultimately, they rejected this notion of multiple establishment, in part because that meant that the government would have to then define what is Christianity, what is true Christianity. Instead, Virginia legislature adopted the Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom. The textbook also points out how Christianity among African Americans became more prominent around the same time period. First of all, one of the justifications for slavery was that the people who had been enslaved were not Christian. And notice 12 million slaves were brought from the west coast of Africa. And when they brought them over, they intentionally separated communities, divided people so they could not resist, rebel, create their own communities. And that meant that they didn't really bring much of their own traditions with them. At first, slaveholders were not interested in Christianizing their slaves. This changed significantly in 1727, when the Bishop of London addressed the concerns of slave owners, saying that if they became Christians, they were still slaves, they're still your property. And after that, many slave owners began introducing their slaves to Christianity. Ironically, many of them really expected that these slaves would work harder, they would be better slaves. Um, It's true that there were some churches, notably the Quakers, who challenged the legitimacy of slavery, but most churches at the time did provide biblical warrants for the institution of slavery. One of the potential essay questions asks, how did Christians justify slavery and oppose slavery by appealing to the Bible? And there is a handout available on Canvas for you to explore how Christians did that. Notice that the Great Awakening helped to bring many slaves into Christianity, and the Baptist and Methodist traditions were, of course, the largest. But as slaves began reading the Bible for themselves, they didn't draw the lessons that the slave owners had expected. Instead, the slaves looked at the stories about Moses setting the captives free, about the prophets who condemned those who lounged on beds of ivory while ignoring the suffering of the orphans and the widows. Um, and increasingly, African Americans appeal to Christianity as a way of challenging the institution of slavery. So in this colonial period, we see the development of American civil religion. This is the idea that the nation state itself is somehow the object of reverence. The idea of America as God's new Israel helped to justify the conquest of the Americas and the pushing of Native Americans off the land. After the revolution, there are a couple ways in which this image of America as God's new Israel would continue to be represented. One is seeing the United States as an asylum of the oppressed, drawing the tired, the poor, the huddled masses yearning to be free. Notice this is what you would find at Ellis Island, inscripted there. The idea that the United States would be a light unto the nations. This comes from the book of Isaiah. The second image is that the United States would be a liberator of the oppressed, banishing ignorance, superstition, poverty, and helping to make the world free. We see different politicians throughout American history drawing upon civil religion. It doesn't matter whether it's Donald Trump or Barack Obama. In different ways, they identify the United States as somehow God's chosen vehicle for making a difference in the world. So, looking briefly at church affiliation after the Revolutionary War, as I said earlier, the Anglican percentage of the population dropped dramatically. Remember, Anglican meaning Church of England. So that American Anglicans would not have to report to England, there was a general convention in 1785 to create the Protestant Episcopal Church, to revise the liturgy, and to allow for there to be bishops that were not beholden to the Church of England. So, in a sense, the Church of England was recreated in the United States, generally known as the Episcopal Church. Baptists, they had become the largest American denomination by 1800, and part of the reason Baptist growth occurred so dramatically is because of their emphasis on the priesthood of all believers. And instead of having to go to college at a time when very few people went to college, and having to have advanced education in order to become a priest or a minister, the Baptist emphasized that if you had had a born-again experience and you loved God and you were willing to learn, that you didn't need to have a fancy education. And so Baptists could turn almost anyone into a minister. Methodists also benefited after the Revolutionary War. Many people don't realize that John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, opposed the American War for Independence. He never did break from the Church of England, but one of his followers, Francis Ayres Asbury, became the first American bishop and created the Methodist tradition separate from the Church of England. So John Wesley actually violated the principles of the Church of England and began ordaining ministers in America in 1784. Notice that the growth is exponential from 15,000 in 1784, and by 1820, they had become the largest American denomination. You'll see that among Protestant denominations, Baptists and Methodists have often been among the largest. There were also non-denominational movements after the Revolutionary War. There was a group of Virginia Methodists led by James O'Kelly, who said, we don't want to be known as Methodists. We don't want to be known as Episcopalians or Anglicans. We want to be known as Christians. And that was inspiring to many people from many different denominations. In 1801, Abner Jones of Vermont Baptist said we should get rid of sectarian names and human creeds, and that piety should be the only test for Christian fellowship and communion. This also corresponds, as we've discussed, with the notions within the Great Awakening that trying to unify various Protestants rather than focusing on the distinctive denominations that they had brought with them to the United States that separated them from each other. The church, Christian Church Disciples of Christ, finds its origins in this time period, and it began as a A couple of non-denominational movements. Barton Stone wrote his Last Will and Testament of the Springfield Presbytery. Notice Last Will and Testament makes you think of death. He was talking about the death of the particularity of his community and wanted to sink into the church at large. Thomas Campbell issued his Declaration and Address, and he wanted to get rid of doctrines that were not found directly in the scriptures, which is basically all of them. He wanted to restore a sense of unity among Christians. His son Alexander became the best known advocate from the Disciples of Christ. And these two movements ended up creating the Campbell Stone movement. They became a denomination which was later split. They didn't succeed in unifying all Christians. Instead, they became one of the larger denominations at the time as well. So Roman Catholics experienced steady growth after the Revolution. Prior to the Revolution, most Catholics lived in Maryland and Pennsylvania. We talked about how Baltimore had been a hotbed for Roman Catholicism, but as the United States expanded and included settlements along the Mississippi, also had new immigrants coming from Ireland and southern Germany, we see that the number of Roman Catholics began to grow again exponentially. If Catholics had been beholden to the Bishop of London when America was a colony, by 1852, the First Plenary Council of American Bishops was held, and the Roman Catholic Church had become larger than any single Protestant denomination. Even though it became larger than any single Protestant denominations, Roman Catholicism would still be a minority tradition, and at least until the 1950s. And we'll talk more about how Roman Catholicism becomes more mainstream in American culture. A final warning that they provide in the textbook is that any estimation of the influence of the churches must recognize that only a third of the nation's population practiced church religion, and second, large numbers of African slaves and numerous Indian tribes practiced a religious life that didn't reflect the Sunday worship of Protestants or Catholics. So this provides an overview of the birth of the Republic and the Republic in the churches. If you have questions or comments, please email me.